Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 18 of the American Pageant titled Renewing the Sectional Struggle from 1848 to 1854. As always, we're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or a later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it, the content's going to be the same. To start off, here are the key concepts for this chapter. These are located at the beginning of every chapter in the American Pageant. I know I say this every time, but really try to match the key terms from the chapter to each of the bullet points here because it will really help you organize the information and it'll help you pull information from your mind during the LEQ or the DBQ when you'll need that outside knowledge, so definitely try to keep that in mind. Okay, so to start off, let's talk about what happens now. Following the Mexican-American War, there is a bunch of new territory that the US has just acquired, and the big question surrounding all of it is it going to be free, is it going to be slave, or is it going to be a mix? And there are several groups that want to push their own agendas, whether it be making the territories free states or making the territories slave states. For example, you have fire eaters who were Southerners that threatened secession if the territories didn't become slave states, and it shows how urgent the issue of slavery is, and this is again foreshadowing the Civil War. They are threatening to leave the Union if they don't get their way with the slaves. Basically what happened during the Civil War, or really at the beginning of the Civil War. So keep that in mind. And so to try and resolve this issue, Senator Lewis Cass, a Democrat, proposed an idea known as popular sovereignty, and it said that the people living in the territories should be the ones to decide whether or not the territory would be a slave state. So this kept with the tradition of self-rule and self-determination that the US so much loves. Essentially, they're saying, let's just let the people decide, and whatever happens, happens. And as we'll see, this will get implemented later on. You should also know about the Free Soil Party. This was an independent anti-slavery party that opposed the extension of slavery into new territory. And to broaden their appeal, they called for federal aid in internal improvements and free homesteads for settlers. Again, they're trying to expand their base of support so that if people support one of their goals, they support all of their goals. However, keep in mind that the Free Soilers, although they wanted abolition, it was not on moral grounds. They said that white workers would have to compete with slaves for work, which would eventually end wage-earning labor and prevent social mobility. So again, even though the end is essentially the same, the motives are different depending on the group. And you see the Free Soilers really come to play in the election of 1848. The Free Soilers nominate Martin Van Buren, and the Democrats choose Lewis Cass, who again is for popular sovereignty, and ultimately, the Whigs candidate, Zachary Taylor, if you remember, he fought in some of the battles in the Mexican-American War, wins because he refused to take a stance on slavery and was hailed a national hero for, again, being in the Mexican-American War. And one really important event that further makes the whole slave state or free state issue so much more urgent is the California Gold Rush in 1849. And essentially, gold is found in California, and thousands of people fled to the state in search of more, although only a few really got lucky, and these people were known as the 49ers, which is where you get the team name. And because of the dramatic population increase as a result of the gold rush, California asked to join the Union as a free state. But Southerners feared that if Congress accepts their offer, it will set a precedent for the rest of the Mexican cession land and could destroy the sectional balance, favoring non-slave states. So California is a very big state. It takes up a good chunk of the American coast. And at this point, it was really the South would get slave states and the North would get free states. So if they let California be completely a free state, that meant that it was sort of pervading the southern area where it was supposed to be slave, and that could set a precedent like, okay, if that area is free and it's in the South, then other areas in the South can also be free. So this is very upsetting for the South. But Southern tensions further increased with the Underground Railroad. We all know that Harriet Tubman created it, and essentially this railroad consisted of stations where abolitionists would house runaway slaves to eventually help them reach their freedom in Canada. So the stations would be like houses, the slaves would hide in the house, somewhere in an attic, where even if the police searched for them, they wouldn't be found, and they would keep doing that house to house until they reached Canada. But eventually, a decision is reached as to what's going to happen with the Mexican cession land. Congress is called into session to decide specifically what to do with California since they had requested to become a state. And so Henry Clay, who as we remember, is a big fan of compromises, maintains this approach and says that California could be a free state, but the other slave states would have stricter fugitive slave laws to ensure owners didn't lose any more of their slaves. So again, we're seeing a compromise trying to be reached to avoid a bigger conflict. In fact, Daniel Webster even expands on this idea in his 7th of March speech in 1850, where he says that slavery would probably not even be necessary in the arid cession land, which proved to be false because the land was actually kind of usable and could be used to grow various crops, and said that the North should make some concessions in order to prevent disunion, and abolitionists wanted to prevent disunion at all costs while also improving the plight of slaves. So although the goal of abolitionists is to free slaves or prevent slavery from further expanding, the Union is also very central in their goal. And although some Northerners became gradually accepting of a compromise, many Southern fire eaters refused concessions. They wanted all or nothing. Either it becomes a slave state or we're leaving. And you're going to see that this will really exacerbate the issues within the nation leading up to the Civil War. But eventually a decision is made with the Compromise of 1850, and this said that California would be admitted as a free state, while Utah and New Mexico, which were the other Mexican cession lands, would be territories where slavery would be decided based on popular sovereignty, the idea proposed by Lewis Cass, where people would choose what they wanted. Additionally, the slave trade, not slavery itself, but the slave trade, would end in Washington, D.C., and a stricter Fugitive Slave Act would be passed. And this overall favored the North because California was admitted as a free state, but neither side was really content with it. In fact, the fugitive slave law was particularly annoying for the North, and this was really the only concession granted truly to the South, but it set high penalties for anyone who helped runaway slaves and motivated law enforcement officers to retrieve slaves for a greater financial reward. Additionally, slaves were forbidden from testifying at court and were denied a jury if they were to go to trial for something. So, although the North tried to overlook this as first as a simple concession for the South, it was not possible for them because of how detrimental some of its aspects were. And this is actually what convinced moderates and neutrals in the North to become staunch abolitionists to really fight to end slavery. And this also leads to some personal liberty laws in the North, which said that local jails cannot be used to house runaway slaves and generally weakened the law enforcement's abilities to effectively do anything. So again, we're seeing that the North is resistant to this idea, and it's going to further their passion for the cause. And keep in mind that although the North is upset with this law and other things that have happened with the South, real conflict doesn't start until 1860, when Lincoln is elected and the Southern states secede, which gave the North plenty of time to accumulate supplies and manufacturing prowess. In fact, this is one of the things that really helps the Union win the war, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. But until then, let's talk about the rising tensions during the 1850s. This really starts off with the election of 1852, and it's notable because the Whigs missed an opportunity to nominate Daniel Webster or President Fillmore, who had replaced General Taylor after he died, because both of them were notable in their efforts to compromise and be bipartisan, something that the country really needed right now in this incredibly divisive time. Instead, they chose a war hero, Winfield Scott, since war heroes tended to win. Although this is in theory a good strategy in a normal election, this was far from a normal election because the country was again super divided. And the Democrats chose a dark horse candidate, Franklin Pierce, because he was a pro-Southern Northerner who wanted to continue expansion. So this is sort of bipartisan. And then the Free Soil Party runs John Hale. He's not really significant in the greater scheme of things, but that's just so you know. And keep in mind that the Democrats who run Franklin Pierce, they ultimately win because the Whigs are so divided over the slavery issue. And this also marks the end of the Whig Party in future elections. They aren't going to be very significant in the future. However, you should note that the Whigs were crucial in their attempts to compromise and uphold the Union. Their values were definitely well-intentioned. However, despite the divisive domestic climate that the US is dealing with, they still are continuing to be involved internationally. For example, in 1848, the British increasingly expands in Central America, so the US signs a treaty with New Granada, which is present-day Colombia, that allowed them to cross the isthmus as necessary and eventually led to the creation of the railroad, though it was not nearly as significant domestically as the 1869 Transcontinental Railroad was. That last part isn't really that important for right now because we'll talk about the Transcontinental Railroad later, but just so you know. But the reason I'm telling you this right now is because it leads Britain and the US to sign the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty in 1850, and it essentially avoided a full-blown conflict by stating that both countries would protect the neutrality of Central America and that neither power would exclusively try to control a waterway there. This was later revoked in 1901 with the treaty that gave the US control over Panama Canal. Again, not really significant right now, but just so you know in the future. But one really important thing you should know about that will have significant effects domestically is the Ostend Manifesto, and this really occurs after President Pierce tries to buy Cuba and is refused by Spain, who owns Cuba, and the South wants him to start a war to get Cuba. So this is sort of similar to the Mexican-American War. Remember, Polk didn't get what he wanted from Mexico, so he went to war with them in the Mexican-American War. Same thing happening here. But President Pierce doesn't do that just yet. He first secretly sends a diplomat offering $120 million for Cuba, and if Spain refuses for that, then the US can take Cuba. And these plans are leaked, which causes free soilers and other abolitionists to be outraged at this attempt to form what they call a slaveocracy, and so the plan is dropped. They really think that the South is trying to build this slave empire. And especially since this was all done very secretively, the Free Soilers and the North are getting increasingly suspicious. And this again shows how the issue of slavery is limiting US territorial gains. Because territory is such a controversial thing at the time, the US is hesitant to even go as far. And you should know, with the acquisition of California and Oregon, the US is able to tap into Pacific markets, specifically Asia. But before we talk about that, let's talk a little bit about what happened with Asia under President Tyler's administration, because communicating with Asia and specifically China is not new to the US by any means. It really starts with the Opium War, where British traders established their right to sell opium in China. They gained access to 5 ports, which essentially meant they gained control over Hong Kong. And so as a result of this, America also wants some concessions. So President Tyler decides to send a diplomat to China, and eventually they signed the Treaty of Wangya in 1844. This was the first official treaty between the US and China, and it granted the US equal trading rights in China and greatly expanded the trading there. It also allowed for Americans accused of crimes in China to be tried before US officials there instead of a completely Chinese court. So you're seeing the idea of US being involved in Asia is not completely new. But flash forward to the administration of President Fillmore, you have the Treaty of Kanagwa in 1854. And with plenty of gifts in hand and threat of force, of course, the US convinced the usually isolationist Japan to sign this treaty, allowing for the US to have coaling rights in Japan and better treatment of shipwrecked sailors. So again, the US is more involved in all parts of Asia. But aside from these international events, let's talk about domestic ones, specifically the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. The US decides to buy a small area of land from Mexico for $10 million, which will be necessary in building an efficient path for future transcontinental, meaning coast-to-coast railroads. This will also physically connect the Mexican cession land to the rest of the US to ensure that they don't break away, but the South isn't really that excited about this land. Aside from this, Representative Stephen Douglas proposes an idea where the territory of Nebraska is split into Kansas and Nebraska, 2 states, and popular sovereignty would decide slavery in both of them. This would promote Western settlement, and Southerners see this as a way to gain a slave state, so now they're interested in this area of land. And this is all really seen in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This said that, again, popular sovereignty would decide the issue of slavery in the Kansas and Nebraska territories, but it was a violation of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which said that slavery couldn't exist beyond the 3630 line. This increases tensions on both sides and eventually leads to the creation of the Republican Party. So this essentially means that the Union is officially in danger. People are extremely mad at each other. The South is like, I can't just change my whole way of life. The North is also upset at them. It's really divisive during this time, and we're going to see that continuing throughout the 1850s. So yeah, that'll do it for this video. Here are the credits for how we got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions. Please be sure to like, subscribe, all of that, you know the drill. And yeah, see you in the next chapter.